Our next speaker is John Bolduc, who's the environmental plan for the city of Cambridge, and he's going to be talking about what Cambridge is doing. Thank you, John.
Well, good afternoon. So mostly I'm going to talk about Cambridge's climate change vulnerability assessment in terms of why we're doing it and how we're going about doing it. Be a little bit anticlimactic in that we don't have results yet to share, although you did get some teasers in Kirk Bosma's presentation earlier today. And probably most of you are from the area, so you know Cambridge well, so I won't go through the details, but in Cambridge, we feel we have a lot at stake in regards to climate change. While we are geographically a small city, we have a lot of people and a lot of jobs packed in to our boundaries, and of course we're also the home of renowned institutions like MIT and Harvard, as well as being a global biotech center and the home to many knowledge-based economic endeavors that are important not only to Cambridge but to our regional economy and beyond. So it's very important that we understand what climate change means to our community in some very specific ways. Sort of a map of the distribution of the knowledge-based companies. We know in Cambridge, when we started working on climate change, it was probably about 1999, we were solely focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because back then we were all thinking we could still prevent climate change. In fact, when we did our 2002 climate change action plan, we had a specific discussion about whether we should have included adaptation in that plan, and the Citizens Task Force that we worked with then was adamant that we not include it because everyone felt like that was conceding defeat. But of course, things have changed since then. We see the science, we understand the science of climate change. We observe the changes, the melting of or the receding of the Arctic ice cap, the melting of the glaciers, rising sea level, temperatures going up. We see climate change happening. We see what the modeling is telling us about what the trends are going to be in the future, given where emissions are going. And so we know what the implications are there, and we see events like Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy and what they've done to other communities. That tells us that we have to be prepared for climate change, both for extreme events and for a changing normal in terms of the everyday climate parameters that we're going to experience. So the question for us is not whether we have to plan for climate change. Our question is really about what impacts do we plan for and when do we need to be prepared for them. So about 10 years ago, we started seeing images like this. Actually, some even before then. I think it's Paul's fault, really. But so if you work on climate change in the Northeast, you probably know Paul, because I think all climate change roads go through Paul one time or another. But in any event, this image, I think, was generated for the Union of Concerned Scientists report around 2008. Here you're seeing a bathtub analysis showing with, Cambridge being over in here, showing that with sea level rise of a couple of feet and a 100-year storm, that a storm surge might reach into Cambridge. Well, Cambridge has never experienced storm surge flooding, at least not in anyone's memory. So we haven't had any experience having to deal with. So the idea that we have to deal with it is a novel thing. But these kinds of images got a lot of attention, both from the community and stakeholders and from the city government. So, but the question here was really, what's the threshold at when we have to start worrying about this seriously and start taking action? And just having the static image of a scenario isn't enough to tell us that. So And then there's similar images. It's more refined, obviously. So this is a map of Cambridge, and the blue areas are reflecting the hurricane inundation areas that the Army Corps of Engineers has mapped. And this is from a recent update. And this is based on the slosh model and using a Category 2 hurricane that takes, I think, a northwesterly track. And so you can see here kind of what's at risk. The area we're standing in, that we're meeting in MIT, is in the inundation area. Much of Kendall Square, which is the heart of our economy, is in the area. There's a power plant on the Charles River. There are densely settled residential areas that are at risk. Our water supply is at risk. The Red Line subway runs through this area as well. So there's potentially a lot at risk. But we ask ourselves, is this what we should plan for? And if so, when should we start? But we have a lot of questions about how this kind of map was generated, and whether these bathtub and slosh models are really reliable enough for us to make decisions on things that have, very high stakes. There's a lot of very valuable property, a lot of high-end businesses, and a lot of people that you'd have to be asking to spend money, to accept new taxes maybe, to accept new regulations. And so because we have questions, we're not sure this is the right analysis for us to be planning on. And in part, our questions come from the fact that we know the topography between Cambridge and Boston Harbor is very complex. Unlike Boston, Cambridge is upstream of two dams, the Charles River Dam and the Amelia Earhart Dam, which is on the Mystic River. And Cambridge is split between the Charles River and the Mystic River watersheds. And we also know that on the Charles River side, besides the dam, there's also a lot of complicated topography in terms of there being a lot of structures, highways, and other buildings and other things that will influence the flow, storm surge flows that might come through. And on the Mystic River side, that side, the northwesterly side of Cambridge, is basically upstream of the Mystic River on the Alewife Brook tributary, so the surge might not even reach up into the area, but it would have influence over flooding associated with that brook. So it's complicated. You've seen this image a couple of times already, showing what would have happened in the Boston area if Hurricane Sandy had hit here instead of New York. And so this is the flooding at high tide. So when Boston looks at this, they're seeing 30% of the city being potentially affected by flooding. But when Cambridge looks at it, we see up here, it's just a small part, but we see we're not flooded. The dam actually provides us some measure of protection. So not that we're feeling that lucky about it, but it tells us that this dam is a very important factor in our considerations. But we have to also be cognizant that with sea level rise, that picture may change, because the dam was obviously designed for conditions that were in the past and aren't going to be the conditions in the future. So, but the dams are storm surge barriers for Cambridge now, and parts of Boston as well, like the Back Bay. So in the fall of 2012, the city launched its vulnerability assessment, and this grew out of a recommendation from our Climate Protection Action Committee, which is the advisory committee to the city manager on climate change policy and implementation. And so that reflected the change in thinking from that time when we wouldn't talk about adaptation, seeing all of the information coming out of the science, seeing the actual observed changes in climate, and seeing what the models are telling us about where things might go, our advisory committee recommended that the city do a vulnerability assessment and start preparing. And the city manager actually readily, Bob Healy at the time, readily accepted that recommendation and gave the city departments their marching orders to start working on it. And it took us a while to figure it out. But basically, we launched our effort a couple weeks before Superstorm Sandy hit New York and New Jersey, just by chance. Well, to go back, so our goals with the assessment are we want to understand the vulnerabilities and risks to Cambridge's population, to our buildings, and our infrastructure, and to do it in economic and public health terms. We think those are the terms that people are going to relate to and understand. So it's not just a matter of overlaying flooding maps on top of maps of Cambridge. There's also a lot of different kinds of effects that can happen, and it's going to be difficult to deal with all of them at one time. So our project is also going to rate and prioritize these vulnerabilities. And another key part of our project is we want to engage the community and key stakeholders in understanding what climate change means to Cambridge, and bring them along with the city in developing that understanding, because in the end, we're all going to have to come together to agree on what it is we have to do about it. So we have basically a two-phase project, the first phase being the assessment, and the basic idea is the vulnerability assessment is the technical part of the project and will serve as the technical foundation for the preparedness plan that's going to follow. And as I said, we have a lot of engagement built into the project. We have an expert advisory panel giving us feedback on our methods that's involved experts here at MIT and Harvard, BU, and Union of Concerned Scientists. We have a technical advisory committee, which is really the stakeholder committee. It's a 16-member committee that includes the utility, telecommunications, major commercial property owners, residents, businesses, and several state agencies. And we've also been reaching out to the community, so not only doing public meetings, but we've made probably over 40 presentations to community organizations like business associations, neighborhood associations, and other groups that wouldn't normally come to a meeting about climate change. So we've gone to them to present to them on their turf. And so far, that effort has gone very well and it's been very well received. I think we were nervous that that people wouldn't want to hear about climate change or would get people scared. But what we found is people took some comfort in the fact that the city was being proactive in planning for this. So it was a very positive response. And we're also engaging beyond our borders. The Regional Planning Agency is working on an adaptation report. Several state agencies are doing things. They're on our TAC, but they're also doing their own studies and projects, and so we're involved with those things. I'll talk about our work with MassDOT some. And we've also been talking with the City of Boston, particularly the Boston Water and Sewer Commission, who I think you'll hear from tomorrow. So we started out with the concern about sea level rise and storm surge flooding, but we know that there are other things we have to be concerned about too. So we're also looking at increasing temperatures and what kinds of heat vulnerability we have to be concerned about. We're looking at extreme precipitation, as you heard from Cameron earlier. Precipitation is becoming more intense, falling in shorter periods of time. And we've already experienced significant street flooding that's overtopped the curve and flooded buildings, caused sewer backups and so forth, and we expect that to happen more often if we don't do anything. And of course, worrying about the big events like Sandy. So these are sort of the things driving our assessment. And the way the project is set up is that we're looking at 2030 and 2070 as sort of target years where we develop scenarios and say, if we do nothing, what might the effects do to Cambridge in those years? So we're developing scenarios around sea level rise, storm surge flooding, flooding from intense precipitation, increased temperatures, and so forth. And we're also running several technical analyses to inform us. So we're doing coastal storm surge modeling. So we're working with Kirk Bosma, who you heard from today. Because the Mass Department of Transportation got a grant and hired Kirk to do that modeling, and I think that came a lot through Paul's conversations with MassDOT. They were very gracious, and we're piggybacking on that study and have extended it into Cambridge. We're also running the modeling on our piped infrastructure to see what happens both with extreme precipitation alone and precipitation plus storm surge flooding, and see what's affected by that. So basically taking the piped infrastructure models we have now and running them with future climate parameters. We're modeling and mapping urban heat islands and also projecting those forward and looking at it in terms of what the experienced temperature is going to be, both from higher temperatures as well as higher dew points. And we're gathering information on various demographic factors that will help us understand social vulnerability. We're doing some economic modeling, and we're also looked at our urban forest resources to see how our more common tree species are vulnerable to flooding and increased temperatures. And so that'll all be basically run through the sieve of a framework that's based on the ICLEI ADAPT framework, which looks at sensitivity and adaptive capacity of critical assets and populations to basically rate and rank vulnerabilities. And then that will feed into the plan. And the end result is basically to come up with priority planning areas and priority issues that will focus our preparedness plan. So I have just a couple minutes left. So to run this assessment, we have an interdepartment steering committee made up of community development, public works, and public health. We've hired an interdisciplinary consultant team led by Kleinfelder, which has offices in Cambridge, but it's an international firm. So they've added sub-consultants with expertise in climate science. We work with Catherine Hayhoe at Texas A&M, public health, economics, infrastructure and engineering, and community outreach. And then we engage our advisory committees. We engage with Boston and the state agencies. So you heard a lot about AdCirc today. AdCirc's the better model, we think, and I can't tell it better than the way Kirk told it, but it's much more refined, much more dynamic, and that's the kind of information we feel we need in Cambridge to really understand our risks. And we've been able to do it for, I think, relatively short money because we didn't have to build the model from scratch. So just sort of a list of the technical tools. So I won't run through this, but basically these are the 2030 scenarios, and we have similar 2070 scenarios, but based on Catherine Hayhoe's downscale climate modeling, we're coming up with parameters on precipitation, temperature, and then adding sea level rise from the National Climate Assessment curves. And this is basically the ADAPT framework for looking at vulnerability. Won't run through that. So we're also putting all this into GIS. We're putting all critical assets and demographic information. And then we'll be overlaying the technical information on flooding and temperature to see what's at risk and also to start understanding interrelationships between systems. And similarly, this is a map with some of the demographic information looking at, I can't read it obviously, but poverty, households with single parents, children under 5 years of age to get a sense of social vulnerability and how that relates to the areas that will be impacted by sea level rise, flooding, and increased temperatures. And looking at our building stock, similarly, trying to understand the key characteristics, like do they have basements, how high are they, things of that sort. And that'll also be overlaid with information. So I'm out of time.
Thank you very much, John. This is time. I'm not going to take any questions now. There's going to be a panel discussion at the end of this. We have a chance to talk to John some more. Actually, I remember when we showed that first map that John showed to some community group. It was actually made by Kelly Need, ASA, but the room was just silence. And then they were sort of shocked when they saw how much flooding they could get from a coastal storm.